My name is Mansour Johnson. This is day 2 of my presentation of my 9 books at the Alton Collins Retreat Center. Books for today are Alexander Part 1, Alexander the Great Part 2, and Travels with Marianne. Before Alexander, there was Marianne. Marianne and I met at Lama. She lived in Switzerland. And for a few years, our relationship consisted in meeting each other in foreign places and traveling together. Our first trip was to Italy, which takes place in the 3rd book, Travels with Marianne. Our 3-month trip to 6 countries takes place in Alexander the Great Part 1. The table of contents tells that story for those who know geography. Each name that I'm going to mention is a chapter. Athens, Edessa, Istanbul and Troy, Assos, Ephesus, Priene, Miletus and Didyma, Bodrum, Santos, Perge, Asphados and Side, Termissos, Olympos, Gordia, Atusas, Ugarit, Osen Suleiman Amrit, Palmyra, Baalbek, Damascus, Abydos in Egypt, Luxor in Egypt, Siwa Oasis in Egypt, Giza in Egypt, Memphis and Saqqara in Egypt. Why in the footsteps of Alexander? Alexander's time, 356 to 322 BC, was a time of oracles. Merchant wrote a chapter about the oracular function of women in the first book I copied, Introduction to Spiritual Brotherhood. Alexander and Merchant were united in their respect for oracles. Alexander's story, as told by Plutarch, involved him visiting oracles. Most notable, the oracle of Zeus Ammon in the Siwa Oasis, deep in the heart of the Sahara Desert. Thanks to Michael Wood's book, In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great, I knew Alexander's path. Let's begin with a journey to the Siwa Oasis in Egypt, and then go to Baalbek in Lebanon. 2 of the most interesting of the 23 chapters in the book. When Alexander arrived in Egypt, his question was how to be recognized as a god, as Pharaoh. He was probably advised by the priests he encountered to seek approval from the oracle at Siwa. When Alexander arrived in Egypt, Siwa was 360 miles into the desert from Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast. Our bus went 32 miles per hour. The landscape is stark. An asphalt track straight through a treeless light brown plain. Alexander's party received rain when the expedition was out of water. And crows showed the way when they were lost. Alexander took these as favorable omens, and his followers took them as signs that Alexander was protected by supranational powers. The oasis of Siwa contained some 300,000 palm trees. The Temple of the Oracle is one of the few spots surviving today that Alexander went inside of. Long story short, a priest related that the answer from the oracle was that Alexander was the son of Zeus Ammon, making him a god. For Alexander, this was mission accomplished because the oracle asserting his divinity was what supported his power as a god. Another chapter that I wanted to share was the Baalbek chapter. Why Baalbek? Baalbek is famous for the large stones comprising the west end of a massive platform, which became a Roman temple in later times. We had walked across the border from Turkey into Syria and hitchhiked to the nearest town. We reached Baalbek in Lebanon by bus from Damascus, Syria. I first heard of Baalbek from the books of Zecharia Sitchin, the most famous of which is called The 12th Planet. His 9 books include titles like Stairway to Heaven, War of Gods and Men, Lost Realms, When Time Began, Cosmic Code, End the Days, Genesis Revisited, and Divine Encounters. I want to tip my hat to Zecharia Sitchin because I used his many books to lead me to many interesting ancient sites, some of which I wrote about in Travels with Marianne, as well as in the Alexander books. Graham Hancock, another contemporary author, visited many of the sites we did. Sitchin and I became correspondents. When he learned I had been to Baalbek, because of him, he asked if he could borrow my photos because he was leading a tour to Baalbek. I sent them to him and he returned them. His book about Baalbek only included drawings of the big stones that I was going to see and photograph. Sitchin, now it gets a little airy-fairy here, considered the platform as a landing spot for his proposed ancient astronauts, the so-called gods from the 12th planet. Gods because, according to Sitchin, they brought civilization. Before I tell you how I debunked Sitchin's theory, I should tell you what his theory is. Sitchin proposed the existence of a 12th planet orbiting Earth with an orbit of 3,600 years. There are 3 significant eras in Earth's history, separated conveniently by 3,600 years. The biblical flood, which Sitchin dates at 11,000 BC, period. From my research, I believe Baalbek's construction began before the flood. I located and photographed the spot on the north side where the massive stone, which is still in the quarry, was supposed to go. So the platform construction was incomplete. Excuse me. My explanation that the massive stone still in the quarry is that construction on the platform was interrupted by the flood, which happened at 11,000 BC. Sitchin writes that humanity was reseeded after the flood by the astronauts from the 12th planet, who visited Earth at 3,600-year intervals. Neolithic culture flourished around 7,500 BC, around 3,600 years since the flood. The next 3,600-year interval takes us to Sumerian civilization. Sumerian civilization flourished around 3,800 BC. Notice the 3,600-year intervals between both of which featured an advance of civilization, which Sitchin ascribes to the astronauts from the 12th planet. To quote from the book, according to Mesopotamian cylinder seals and Hittite rock carvings, the gods were present among mankind. I saw some of these in Turkey at a place called Yazilakaya, near Hattusis. If this is a slideshow, I'd have pictures of all these, and they're in the book, but unfortunately I can't do more than talk about them. Sitchin claims that gods from the 12th planet improved mankind at those intervals, just as it is a mystery how the Great Pyramid in Egypt was built. The three big stones known as trilithons at Baalbek are so massive, no modern crane could lift them. So it's a mystery how they got in place in the first place. You remember the planets, the 12 planets, 3,600-year intervals. If the gods that causes Sumerian civilization to flourish in 3,800 BC, the next flyby would be 300 BC. I debunked Sitchin's theory because none of the ancient Greek historians who wrote about Alexander, like Strabo and Pliny, mentioned another planet flying by. This was cause for me to doubt his premise. Although I continued to investigate the cylinder seals and the Hittite rock carvings, which showed royalty portrayed as gods. The next book in this series is Alexander the Great Part 2. In the footsteps of Alexander the Great Part 2. Let's begin with the cover story. I am pictured standing on the cover in the front of the most sacred shrine in Iran. It is located in Mashhad, in the eastern part of Iran, just a few kilometers from Afghanistan. The cover shows Mansour in Murshid's robe, which I'm wearing. And shall I stand to show it?
Yeah, if you would.
The,
I don't know that we could,
we won't stand up and show it.
yeah, we can cut into it later.
Okay.
Okay.
But I'll show it everybody here. You see, it's a little small. And I'm a lot shorter than I was then, too. The cover shows Mansour in Murshid's robe, which Murshid bestowed on me at some point. I was the first of his crop of hippies to receive a robe, and the robe was made at Murshid's request by one of his students named Jayanara. As a student of Buddhist lore about the teacher passing items to the sixth patriarch, I thought this was meaningful that Murshid gave me his first robe. The robe doesn't fit well. My arms are longer than Murshid's. I brought it to Iran for this purpose. That is, I intended to wear it to enter the most sacred shrine, Islamic shrine I might mention, as a dervish. I couldn't fake it as a Muslim because I never learned and don't know the Islamic prayers. So if I was asked to perform the prayers, I would flunk the demonstration. But dervishes are a little more strange. And so here I am, picture this. In one hand, I have a tasbih, and around my neck is another tasbih. I am chanting almost inaudibly under my breath, but loud enough for the audience in the security room to hear the Islamic affirmation of faith. La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. Over and over and over. That's all you have to do to become a Muslim, is do that 3 times. So I'm doing it at, innumerable times in the presence of all the guards and the security people. And my Turkish not Turkish, well, he was Turkish, but he was living in Iran. He's explaining me, talking for me to the security people. Long story short, my performance of Zikr was my ticket to the Holy Shrine. Now the story of how I got there. And this is the rest of the book. To get to this place at the end of the book, Marian and I followed Alexander together through southern Turkey for 2 weeks to Van, which is in the far eastern part of Turkey, not far from the border of Iran. Marian, my companion for all these trips, was afraid to enter Iran. But because she knew a travel agent in Zurich who was Iranian, my whole itinerary was arranged, perfectly arranged, and I was enabled to visit all the ancient sites in Iran that I had indicated I wanted to see. The travel agent did this for me, and a driver in his personal car was waiting for me when I walked across the border after taking a bus to the border from Van. The driver, a former oil executive, would chauffeur me up and around northern Iran, down to Shiraz, over to Persepolis, up to Susa, and then to Esfahan, visiting many sites on the way. The story of Hafiz's shrine is the best. In Shiraz, there are 2 wonderful shrines, a rose garden honoring Sadi and the nearby tomb of Hafiz. I visited both. And I should read this, especially because Saul is always wanting me to do the walk of Mian Mir. This is a quote now from the book. I began to do the walk of Mian Mir around the pavilion which surrounds Hafiz's sarcophagus of inscribed beige marble. I was given the walk of Mian Mir by Murshid in Bolinas, California. It involves walking very slow. When I began to feel the presence of Murshid, and I refer to the poem Driving Through the Desert at Night, which I describe the way I know a visitation from Murshid is I feel a shiver of bliss, like this. And so when I felt that, I said, I am here, and the ecstatic feeling I associated with Murshid is even more with me, and I go into ecstasy. I'm oblivious to those observing my tears, and after 3 circumambulations around the sarcophagus, I look for my guide named Abbas and have him capture the moment on film. I pose with my happy head on the end of the marble sarcophagus that coincides with Hafiz's head. I was saying my driver took me down to Shiraz, which is where these memorials are, over to Persepolis and up to Susa. Persepolis was the seat of Darius, whom Alexander defeated to inherit the Persian Empire around 300 BC. At 2 places in Iran, I saw foxes. One was on the hill behind the massive Persepolis platform. Another was in Susa, a civilized area from 5000 BC. A so-called royal road ran from Susa to Sardis on the coast of Turkey, a distance of 1,500 miles. All that exists today, besides mounds, at Susa is a French castle built to defend against Arab raiders, and a square kilometer of mounds containing ancient ruins. I saw the fox in the dry riverbed behind the vast area of mounds. And at the castle, the French use homing pigeons to communicate with the archaeologists working in the field because the local Arabs didn't like them, and traveling back and forth was too dangerous. And so they kept homing pigeons to carry messages back and forth. I was saying my driver took me to Persepolis and up to Susa and then Esfahan. There are 9 famous attractions in Esfahan, which we won't go into here. I left my first driver in Esfahan, flew to Mashhad, and was picked up by my second driver. I began the book's talk with the conclusion of the book in Mashhad, where I visited the Holy Shrine and was able to visit because I wore Murshid's robe. After 2 weeks in Iran, another plane took me to Tehran and Zurich, where I delivered the Iranian carpet I purchased for Marianne. At this point, I'd like to conclude this book with some memorable blurbs, which are pieces written at the author's request by people that seem to be famous or he'd be happy to talk about his book. Well, the first one I'm really happy to talk about was from John Kiriakou. I made friends with John when he was in prison for whistleblowing, after I sent him a copy of my book, Murshid. John was a CIA agent who captured in Pakistan the Al-Qaeda operative who is still in Guantanamo. He blew the whistle, John did, on the CIA's torture program. Him, rather than the torturers, served time in prison. One of his books is called A Reluctant Spy, My Secret Life in the CIA's War on Terror. He wrote in part for this blurb, quote, I've read all of Monsieur Johnson's books, and this is the most fun. Then to really flatter me, he wrote, In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great Part 2 is not a travelogue. Instead, it is travel literature, similar to the epic travel journalist and author Paul Theroux. How great to be compared with a famous author. This blurb is 15 lines long and is much appreciated. Another author we all know, Neil Douglas Clods, wrote about the book. Traveling with Mansour is like doing a journey with a walking encyclopedia, who is also a bit of a character out of a Tom Robbins novel. Another flattering comparison. Saadi was a mentor who enabled the book Murshid and was there for counsel on all my books. Saadi's blurb was generous, 19 lines long. Here are some lines from the San Francisco Book Review. In the Footsteps of Alexander has too much substance to be a coffee table book. The pictures and the narrative make it such that I would suggest reading more slowly. The reviewer goes on to advise, I would advise taking your time with this book and lingering over the pictures and the descriptions. Now, the third book for today is the book called Travels with Marianne. The 8 journeys in this book were all with Marianne. This book's subtitle is Italy and Crete, Peru and Bolivia, Paris and Morocco, Mexico and Guatemala. Travels with Marianne has Marianne on the cover. She is halfway up the pyramid at Chichen Itza in Mexico. Her diminutive figure, wearing a white top and black slacks, stands out in relation to the massive pyramid. Let's consider, in the interest of time, one story or more or less from each of these 8 trips. Marianne and I began our many travels in Italy. We met in Milan, known as Milano to Italians. Marianne drove to Milan from Zurich. I flew from New York to Milan, Marianne had arranged for us to stay a few days in a modernized castle in Tuscany. Tuscany's landscape is hills of olive trees and grapevines. I explained in a sentence why I was there. Quote, "It was love and human companionship that inspired my travel and brought me to Italy for the first time. I began to drink wine for the first time in Italy. For the first time, I encountered remnants of the Etruscan civilization. The span of time the Etruscans occupied Italy was 6th, 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries BC. D.H. Lawrence writes about the Etruscans. My chapter is titled The Etruscan Baton, which refers to Lawrence himself, who refers to himself as having received the Etruscan baton. I also received the Etruscan baton from D.H. Lawrence in Tuscany. I seek to live as artfully as the Etruscans." To quote from the book, "Etruscans may be characterized by their love of nature, their celebration of life with banquet scenes of food and drink, pictures of plants and trees etched on long-buried tomb walls." American author Riane Eisler, her work also postulates goddess societies in Crete after seeing these scenes, and that takes us to Crete. The mountain site of the Palace of Knossos near Heraklion, the capital of Crete, is shaped like a woman's breast. And that led Riane Eisler to imagine that this structure, this palace, they call it, was somehow a worship of a female goddess. It inspired Riane to say that, and with this thought in mind, we visited all 4 of the palaces in Crete, the most famous being the big one at Knossos. The legend was that the Palace of Knossos, famous through the mythological ages as a palace where youth from Athens were sacrificed in the labyrinth at Knossos, which was the home of the mythological king Minos. In 1900, an Englishman, Arthur Evans, excavated, and his reconstructions enforced the wrong idea that Knossos was a palace for a king. The gnosis from Riane Eisler, that Knossos was a monument to goddess worship, was also wrong. I debunked both these ideas with help from books purchased locally. Local scholars told a different story. Knossos was a mortuary for the dead, not a goddess temple, nor was it a palace of a king and queen, despite Evans's designation and recreation during his reconstruction of several spaces which are called royal quarters and the Queen's Room. Peru. The Peru chapter begins with a photo of La Candelaria on the shore of the Bay of Paracas in Peru. Eric Donican makes a lot about this mysterious 600-foot tall candlestick carved into petrified sand, 2 feet deep. Sitchin says it was a marker so that ancient travelers, ancient mariners would know where to come to gather the minerals mined in Peru and Bolivia. The figure La Candelaria is well known to scholars of ancient history because various gods with various names are shown with a mining tool in one hand and a forked lightning shaped like La Candelaria in the other hand. For example, the sandstone statue nicknamed El Freya or the brother in the ecclesiastical sense, wielding similar instruments, is located at the Kali Sisaya, located at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. El Candelaria is regarded by Sitchin as a marker, like I said, so ships coming to load tin and gold from Cusco in Peru and Tiwanaku in Bolivia would know where to land. Remember when the Spanish arrived in Cusco, they melted gold by the ton because there was so much gold in Cusco. Zachariah Sitchin's book, The Lost Realms, was my guide for travel in Peru and Bolivia because he wrote about these various sites. And so I had to visit. Unlike his book, The 12th Planet, The Lost Realms deals with legends and native histories and the thesis that the South American civilizations were seeded by astronauts from the 12th planet did not figure here. Rather, Sitchin relied on these ancient legends and unconventional histories and biblical stories. For example, biblical records in the Old Testament, 1 Kings 9, verses 26 to 28, write about Semites from the tribe of Solomon, namely a king named Hiram of Tyre, who went to Ophir, another name for Peru, and brought back 420 talents of gold, which was the source of his great wealth, Solomon's great wealth. After the megaliths at Baalbek, I was curious also about the megaliths in Peru. There are big stones to encounter in Peru near Cusco, at Sacsayhuaman, at Ollantaytambo, and at Machu Picchu, where, by the way, I wanted to debunk the notion that Machu Picchu was simply a 15th century Inca citadel. To get to this area, one flies to Lima, Peru, overnight, and flies to Cusco if the weather permits, because landing at Cusco's 11,152-foot high altitude in erratic weather is sometimes not possible. But these stories await you in the book, and I won't say no more about that. Bolivia. La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, is a short flight from Cusco. It is almost the highest capital in the world, at 11,942 feet. Lhasa in Peru is 11,995 feet. Our main destination is Tiwanaku, earmarked by several scholars as being either 10,150 years old or 4,005 years old. There are megaliths there too, but they are strewn haphazardly around the site. Poznansky, the deepest student and scholar of Tiwanaku, first offered 15,000 years old as the date for Tiwanaku. But then he consulted with the German named Rolf Muller, and they agreed the date of Tiwanaku was either 4,050 years old or 10,150 BC. Tiwanaku is north of La Paz, and the Island of the Sun is a boat ride in Lake Titicaca, north of Tiwanaku. We visited the Island of the Sun, where the legend of the first Inca, Manco Pacic, originated. The first Inca's journey to Machu Picchu and subsequent unfoldment there is not a story I will tell here. Paris and Morocco. These places go together because we launched ourselves to Morocco from Paris after a must-see visit to not only the Louvre, Paris's world-class museum, but also the home of Hazrat Inayat Khan in Surin. I wrote, our purpose in visiting the Louvre was to see objects removed from their original home in the Middle East and moved to Paris. Among the objects I filmed at the Louvre was a stone statue of the storm god of the Assyrians named Adad, standing on a bull. Now the bull, for scholars, is a sign of divinity that signifies the age of Taurus. Taurus, the bull, which dates it to 4,300 BC. One of the implements Adad held in his hand was exactly the same as that carved 600 feet tall in the petrified sand at the Gulf of Paracas in Peru. Same symbol, same tool. The sign, once again, of the ancient connection between East and West to collect minerals like tin from Tiwanaku, whose name was derived from the word tin. And by the way, the mixture of tin and bronze, the mixture of tin and copper produced bronze. The Bronze Age was from 3,300 BC to 1200 BC. So that also helps us date some of these things. The copy in Paris of the Mansour Gate from Meklis fronts the obelisk at the Place de Concorde in Paris. It's a copy. Subsequently, when we got to Morocco, we found the original Mansour Gate. The obelisk at the Place de Concorde was removed from the Luxor Temple in Egypt. So when you go to the Luxor Temple, on the left side is an obelisk. It's like the Washington Monument. The right side, there's no obelisk because it's in Paris. And of course, our host in France when visiting Hazrat Inayat Khan's home in Surin was Sharif Donald Graham. Sharif was working on cataloging Hazrat Inayat Khan's works across the street from Fazl Manzil, the home of the Khans. I met Sharif at Murshid's grave at Lama. Sharif drove up from Tucson with Sheikh Abdul Rahman Daniel Lomax. Pir Bilal had officiated at the gravesite when Murshid was buried there, and regrettably both Sharif and Daniel Lomax have passed on. Morocco. One mission we had in Morocco was a visit to the shrine of Mullah Idris, a famous Moroccan mystic that Shabda had told me about. Shabda is the peer of the Ruhaniyat order. The visit to the Islamic saint in Morocco was a rehearsal for my visit to the holy shrine in Mashhad. Once again, Marianne turned back in fear. There's a long hallway from the front entrance that leads way back, and she got halfway down that hallway and freaked out and left me once again to continue on my way. But I was challenged before I reached the area where the saint was buried. One man asked for my identification card, which presumably lists your religion. Of course, I had no identification card. What finally saved me there was I told him my name, Mansour. Oh, pass on. So Mansour, the name worked, and I was allowed to proceed. Mexico and Guatemala. The subtitle for this chapter describes the 4 topics of this section. The subtitle is Chichen Itza, Palenque, the Olmecs, and Tikal. Chichen Itza, Palenque, and the Olmecs are in Mexico. Tikal is in Guatemala. And we have enough to discuss without going there in this talk. I began this chapter with the sentence, "The traditional history of Mexico is inadequate," followed by Mesoamerican connections with Africans or Phoenicians or Egyptians of the old world are completely omitted or denied altogether. Let's put meat on those bones. First of all, Egyptians are Africans. The Olmecs are representatives of the oldest civilization in Mexico. The Olmecs carved giant stone heads which resemble Negroes. That was enough for me to say the Olmecs came from Africa. But Orthodox view is not that, believe it or not. From color illustrations from the Heraklion Museum in Crete to photographs of Olmec sculptures at the La Venta Park, this book has many, many, many color photos. We visited Chichen Itza because it was, along with Tikal, one of the top Mayan archaeological sites. But Palenque is located on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And this is the one I want to share a story about. There is a legend about Palenque that ties in with other themes in my travel books. Howler monkeys with cries like tigers are heard at Palenque. Howler monkeys at Palenque made the news recently because they were falling dead from the trees because of the heat. Palenque is one of several Mexican archaeological sites that are featured in Indian legends. As an aside, we might mention that the legends of the bearded ones who came to Mexico before Cortez, whose leader was called Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs thought Cortez was Quetzalcoatl returning. But back to Palenque, in more ancient times, legend says Palenque was founded by a voyager from across the sea named Wotan. Before Bishop Nunez de la Vega, in a frenzy of Spanish righteousness, destroyed the Mayan cultural and historical records, he copied fragments that he shared with two other clerics. These accounts were collected and published by another friar. From these accounts, Wotan's arrival date was placed at around 1000 BC. He voyaged 4 times from Chivan, the land of the Hittites. The Bible in Genesis chapter 10 mentions this name, Chivan. Wotan's second visit is noted for his development of mining. Mining happened in Teotihuacan, northeast of Mexico City, at Chava de Huancar on the west side of the Andes, in northern Peru, near present-day Juarez, 11 hours by bus from Lima, and at Tiwanaku, south of Lake Titicaca, several hours north from La Paz. All these places had mineral processing plants. What is more, the name Wotan comes from Wotan, the ancient god of storm. The ancient Middle Eastern gods we have been talking about are often called storm gods. With a name like Wotan, the legendary hero plugs into a Near Eastern god function connected with mining. Depictions of gods from Babylonia and Assyria by the Phoenicians use the name Adad. The Hittites and Kassites used Teshub. Going back to the Sumerians, they used Ishkur, whose epithet was, "He who bronze obtains and divides." All the figures with these names show him with a mining tool in one hand and a pitchfork-like symbol, fork lightning, a Candelario in the other hand. Adad, Teshub, and Ishkur carved his mark on the cliff down in South America at Paracas Bay in Peru. Wotan was upset during his 4th and last visit by, quote, discord and rivalry among the people. Before he left for the final time, he divided his realm into 4 parts, each with a capital. Palenque is the only known capital of the 4. Strangely, no one mentions mining in connection with Palenque. Thank you very much. That's the end of this presentation of my travel books. And what?
Does anyone have any questions or any?
Are there any questions?
When did you make these travels? Especially through the Middle East, like in going to Tehran, places like that. Eastern Turkey.
I wish I knew. I can't remember. Although I think my travels with Marianne started around 2000. And they continued for 4 or 5 years. So that's a rough time frame between 2000, 1999. Well, in fact, the title for the first Alexander book was, or the subtitle was the 1998 Footsteps of Alexander Tour. So that dates that. And subsequent to that, later on, into the 2000s, was a visit to Iran. Anyone else? Okay. No further questions, and we'll wrap this talk. Thank you very much.